Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're reading Swamp Thing number 120. And just a little catch up on what had been going on in the last couple of issues. Swamp Thing's daughter, Tefé, who is a toddler, has been having issues with her powers, specifically how much power she has for how little she is. We've seen her previously actually flay humans with her powers, but they were all bad men who were trying to hurt her mom and her. So when she did that same thing to a kitten for just scratching her on the face, it really freaked out Swamp Thing, but more importantly, it really freaked out Abby. So Swamp Thing, kind of going against what Abby wanted, went down to the Parliament of Trees and asked them for help. And then when he returned, he found out that Abby and Tefé had gone to the store, and while they were there, Tefé was kidnapped by a guy that's been in the background of the whole Nancy Collins run. We've been seeing different children being kidnapped and also their bodies later on, so this guy is a serial child killer. So it's very important that they find her fast. Abby did go to the police initially, but Swamp Thing is able to take care of it on its own. He tracks down his daughter and he breaks apart the house that the man is keeping her in. And the man actually ends up being killed by another swamp monster that wanted vengeance on him. And he actually had Tefé with him, so she was in the swamp alone for a couple minutes. And when Abby and Swamp Thing realize this, they start freaking out a little bit. But then all of a sudden, a woman comes out of the swamp and she is holding Tefé, and she is not a normal woman. She is an elemental, just like Swamp Thing, and she introduces herself as Lady Jane, and she is here at the behest of the Parliament of Trees to help train Tefé in her powers. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 120, we have the cover. We see a naked woman in a fetal position, and she is floating underwater, and in big letters on the bottom of the page is the name Lady Jane. And we also see that this is written by Nancy Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMolder. So we start off in Swamp Thing and Abby's house in the middle of the swamp. And it seems that they've returned back here after Tefé was kidnapped. And Abby is not happy about what went down, specifically all the stuff with Lady Jane finding Tefé and bringing her out from the swamp. So Abby and Swamp Thing are arguing and she's saying, "I don't care. I won't tolerate that woman in my house." And Swamp Thing tries to calm her down saying, "Now, Abby." But she cuts him off and says, "Don't you now Abby me. I don't want her here. That's that." And Swamp Thing responds, "You're not being fair. You were worried about teaching Tefé how to control and understand her elemental powers. That is why I returned to seek the Parliament's counsel. Lady Jane volunteered to help. She uprooted herself, separating herself from the group mind of the Parliament to come here. Abby, don't you realize what that means?" And while he's talking, we do see a panel of what's going on with Lady Jane. She's not in the house hearing this necessarily. She is outside having a tea party with Tefé and Tefé's stuffed animals. And Abby goes over to their window and sees this tea party going on, and she says, "No, I don't, and I don't want to. This is just another excuse for the Parliament to stick its collective nose where it doesn't belong. I can raise my little girl just fine without their help." And then Swamp Thing comes over and puts a hand on her shoulder and says, "You know that's not true." But Abby is not having any of that. She turns around and says, "How dare you take their side against me?" And Swamp Thing kind of pulls back and says, "Abby, this is not like you." And then Abby starts crying and she says, "How do you expect me to react, damn it? In the course of 12 hours, my only child is stolen right from out under my nose by a deranged serial killer, then rescued by some weird cut-and-paste monster, and the first person she's comforted by isn't me, her mother, but some overgrown vegetable tricked out like Morticia Adams. All I need right now is my own husband to say I'm incapable of raising my own child." And Swamp Thing says, "Abby, you know that's not what I meant. Sweetheart, I realize you've been under a great deal of pressure with all that has happened, but we have to face facts. Tefé, as much as we love her, is not a normal child. She must be taught how to use her powers. As the Green's active champion, I can only do so much. Besides, my knowledge is limited. I do not share the Parliament's eons of acquired wisdom." And Swamp Thing is feeling like he's getting somewhere with this argument. Like, he's making rational points, and she's definitely going to come around to his side sooner or later. So he's kind of smiling as he says, "Besides, Tefé seems to have taken an immediate shine to Lady Jane. Isn't that encouraging? But he has misread this situation because Abby shrugs off his hands and says, "You didn't pay attention to anything I said, did you? I want you to get rid of her. I don't care how you do it. Just do it." And then Swamp Thing kind of reaches out and says, "Abby, you are behaving like. And then Abby cuts him off saying, "Like what? A human?" And then Swamp Thing grabs her by the wrist and says, "Right." And she looks kind of surprised that he did that. And she says, "Alec, what do you think you're doing?" And then he pulls her by the wrist and takes her outside. And as he's walking over to Lady Jane, he says, "I did not want to make such a rash action, but you forced my hand." And I think Abby's genuinely scared. She says, "Alec, what do you mean by that? Alec?" And he replies, "I had hoped you would be different, that you could put aside your distrust of things that are strange. You fear things you do not know. If you are to be the consort of the Green's champion, you must never fear knowledge." And while he's saying this, he's walked over to Lady Jane and he's taken like an acorn that's grown out of her skin, much like the tubers that Swamp Thing grows himself. And he takes that acorn and he forces it into Abby's mouth, and she begins to trip out and she starts to have a vision. And as we turn the page, we get a full page splash. And this is a pretty cool, interesting drawing. We see a Victorian English woman standing by a tree as her husband packs up a horse and carriage. And then it seems like they're leaving a house that is on this property. And then above that, we see Abby's head is inside of the clouds. So she's watching this story take place. And there's some narration that says, "The year is 1851. The place is the county of South Yorkshire, England. My name is Alicia Houston, and this is the first day of my descent into hell." And we see that the name of this issue, of course, is Lady Jane. And we can't really see what the woman looks like because the shot in the panel is of her from behind. But as we turn the page, we see that this woman looks like she has either brown or reddish hair. And I thought at first that maybe she was black because she has very tan skin, or what it looks like. But I think it's just the coloring, because never once did they mention that in the story. And also her husband, who is obviously supposed to be a white British guy, is very tan looking as well. So I think it was just an issue with the coloring on this. But anyway, we see that she looks pretty sad and she's looking at this house as they're about to leave. And the narration says, "Soon I shall be gone, taken away from this place, the house where I was born, where I was married, where I was delivered of my first child, gone, never to return." And then a single tear begins to form and run down her cheek. And the narration says, "It's not fair. None of this was my doing. It was all his fault." And as we zoom out from her face, we do see that she is in fact pregnant. And her husband, who looks like your standard white Victorian gentleman, he's got, a mustache and a suit on. And he's holding their first baby and he's saying, "Alicia?" And then we get a little flashback from her mind of them courting. And we're seeing a panel of him proposing to her and then their wedding day. And the narration says, "It began with such good auspices. He was from a respectable family with a position at the bank. Not too old, not too young. Father approved of the match. There was even a chance I might come to love him in time. What more could a young woman ask for? The first year was blissful. I stayed at the family croft while Alistair kept a room in town to be close to his work. Our time together was precious and heavenly. Shortly after Ruth was born, things began to change. There was a scandal at the bank, and Alistair soon lost his position and the apartment in town. Our time became less and less blissful." And in the panel under this narration, we're seeing that as she's at home taking care of the kids, he's also at home sitting at the dinner table getting drunk. And the narration continues, "He soon fell in with a bad crowd, fellows with silver tongues and an endless stream of money-making schemes. By the time I discovered he'd mortgaged my ancestral land and home, it was too late. I had no say in the matter. Everything I had owned became his the moment I said I do." And then we get a panel of her looking back at her home as they drive off in their horse and buggy. And the narration continues, "Pastor Lovejoy told me I shouldn't fear going to Sheffield. He says God looks after those women who have faith in their husbands. One must keep one's faith regardless, or one is lost." And then we see their buggy pulling into an alleyway that looks like they're going to be living in like a tenement building or something now. They went from like a really nice house to a very, very rundown part of Sheffield. And the narration continues, "Sheffield is hell. I hear London is 1,000 times worse, but I do not live in London. I live here." Our new home is in the area where the common laborers live. We cannot afford better. The River Dawn is little more than a stone's throw from my back step. The water smells at night, and the rats get into the house. I live in fear of them biting Ruth. Alistair works 12-hour days, 7 days a week at the steel mill. He makes 6 pence an hour. Not that I see much of that. Most of it is spent on gin and bitter at the public house. So under that narration, we're kind of seeing her do her day-to-day where she's doing a bunch of laundry, and you can just tell that she hates being here. But while she's outside hanging the laundry, her and her new neighbor kind of strike up a conversation. They get introduced, and the neighbor says, "I'm Emma Wesley. I'd have introduced myself earlier, but I've been tending to my cousin over in Doncaster. I just got back today. Why don't you bring your wee one over here and we have some tea?" So Jane agrees, and I should say that Miss Wesley is a larger, kind of middle-aged woman. So Jane brings Ruth over to her house, and they hang out and drink some tea, and the narration says, "My parents would never have approved of my consorting with such a lowly person as Emma, but mother and father are dead, and I have been so very, very lonely." Emma works at the textile mill. They prefer to employ women and children because their fingers are slimmer and nimbler, and they have fewer accidents, or so they say. It's good to have a friend after all the time I've spent alone. Alistair, however, does not see it that way. Then we get a panel of Alistair hitting Jane saying, "Where's my dinner, woman? You've been spending time with that wretched cow next door, is that it?" And as Jane falls to the ground, we do see that Ruth, their child, is there as well, seeing all this. So of course she begins to cry, and Jane goes over to Ruth and tries to comfort her, and we see the shadow of her husband taking a big drink out of a bottle. And we see Jane looking at him with an extreme amount of resentment in her face, and she thinks to herself, "Swine." Then we cut to a little while later where Jane, who's been pregnant this whole time, is giving birth to her second child. And they're doing it old-fashioned style where there's a midwife, or at least a couple helpers, and she's standing over a tub as the baby is coming out. And one of the people helping her is Emma. And in fact, Jane is actually hugging Emma, trying not to fall as she's standing over this tub giving birth. And the narration says, "I could never have made it through my second delivery without Emma. It's a boy." Alistair seems pleased. He wants to call him Albert after the prince. Alistair stopped by the pub on the way to work to spread the news of his son and heir's safe arrival. And in this panel, we're actually seeing Alistair get super drunk with a bunch of friends, and they're celebrating. And this is before work, so as he goes to work at the steel mill, he's drunk, and you can imagine that that is not a good thing to be at a steel mill with molten metal. And the narration continues. Then he reported to work in time to die in horrible burning agony. So as he's moving one of these giant carafes of molten metal with a hook, he does something wrong, and this giant carafe of molten metal spills all over his body. Then we get to his funeral, and the narration says, "I will not cry. I cannot delude myself into believing that there was any love in my heart for Alistair Houston. He was my husband and father of my children, nothing more. What consumes me is not grief for my lost mate, but fear for my children and myself. How will we survive? What can I do? I was not raised to work outside the home. Mother never prepared me for young widowhood. She didn't even tell me where babies came from." And we're seeing Jane and her children watch as the husband's casket is lowered into the grave. Then we cut to the textile mill where Emma works, and the narration says, "Emma got me a job at the same textile factory where she works. The pay isn't much, and I have to work long hours, but it's enough to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table, for now. Thanks to the gas lights, we work before daybreak and stay long after dusk. Some of the women who work here never see the sun at all, but the saddest of all are the children who work here. They do not laugh or talk, and it's forbidden for them to play. They are more like the ghosts of children rather than children themselves. I would rather see my Ruth dead than working in one of these hellholes." Then we cut to a morning before work, and we're seeing that Jane has to leave her children with one of Emma's kids named Miriam during the day while they're at work. And Miriam isn't that much older than the other kids. She's maybe like 9 or 10, and she has to even like stand on top of a chair in order to reach a pot that she's cooking from. So as the women are getting ready to leave, Emma tells Miriam, "See that the rats stay out of the cradle, and don't burn the house down, dear." So this is definitely not the best environment to leave a child in, and Jane knows that because her narration says, "I don't like leaving Ruth and Albert at home with no one but Emma's oldest girl to watch over them. Miriam is a good child, but far too young. But what choice do I have? Unless they're tending machines, the factory does not tolerate children at the workplace." Then we cut to Emma and Jane at work that day, and in the panels, there's a man walking around. I'm assuming it's the floor boss, and he seems to be paying extra attention to Jane. And Jane's narration says, "Today the floor boss, Mr. Proctor, paid me a great deal of attention. He seems a nice man in a rather stern way. He reminds me of my father somewhat. He said he wanted to see me later that afternoon. Something about me off the mill floor." And when Jane tells Emma this, Emma says, "I wouldn't trust that one no further than I could throw him. Mark my words, lass, men are nothing but beasts, interested in one thing and one thing alone." And Jane, who's still kind of a proper lady, is taken aback by the crassness of Emma's language, and she says, "Don't be crude, Emma. That might be true of the louts who work at the mills and the mines, but hardly a man of Mr. Proctor's station." And Emma replies, "I may be crude, but at least I be no fool." So it seems that Jane does not heed Emma's warning, because as she's walking into Mr. Proctor's office that night, the narration says, "Sometimes I wish Emma were not so coarse and quick to doubt the behavior of others." And it seems like maybe at first Jane is right, because we see her sitting at a desk with a typewriter. She has become Mr. Proctor's new secretary. And the narration says, "I have been working as Mr. Proctor's secretary for a month now. The pay is much better than what I received working on the floor, and my hours are nowhere near as long." But then we see Mr. Proctor stand up and walk over to her, and the narration says, "However, there are a few drawbacks to my work, the biggest of which is Mr. Proctor." And we see him walk over to her and put his hand on her shoulder, and her looking kind of hesitant and disgusted. And then we cut to a panel of him having sex with her bent over the desk. And the narration says, "I tell myself that what I allow him to do to me is not a sin. I consent to his caress in order to house and feed my children. I receive no thrill at his touch, experience no joy from his rough attentions. It's something I must endure in order to survive, nothing more. If it is a sin, then it's a very small one. After all, it only takes 3, perhaps 4 minutes, and then I can get back to my work." Then we cut to a panel of her throwing up in the morning, and Emma is trying to help her out, and the narration says, "God, oh God, please let it be food poisoning or the influenza. Let it be cholera or diphtheria. Let it be anything, except I know what it is." So you may have guessed, she is pregnant for Mr. Proctor. So the next panel we see is her standing in front of Mr. Proctor's desk, about to tell him that she is pregnant, and the narration says, "I keep telling myself that I have nothing to fear. Mr. Proctor is a good man, an honorable man, a Christian man. Surely he would not turn his back on the mother of his unborn child." Then we get a panel of her working again down on the floor of the textile mill, and the narration says, "Emma was right. I am a fool." Then we cut to Jane later that night crying at the dinner table with Emma, and she's saying, "Lord help me, Emma. What am I going to do? I barely make enough to feed myself and the children as it is. I can't afford another mouth." And Emma looks over at Jane's kids and says, "You could put Ruth to work in the mill." But Jane looks up suddenly and says, "Never. I'd rather die than consign my child to that horrible place." And then Emma looks at her and says, "There's always Granny Catgut." Then we cut to a panel of a witch who was apparently named Granny Catgut. Now, I don't know if she's actually a witch, but she definitely has a cauldron and is wearing a robe, much like, a witch. So Granny Catgut is talking to Jane saying, "Aye, all the women in the district find their way to me sooner or later. I pride myself on being professional." And then she hands Jane some sort of potion in a glass vial, and Jane asks, "Well, will it work?" And the witch kind of laughs and says, "Oh, it'll work all right." And Jane asks, "What's in it?" And the witch says, "Oh, a pinch of ginger, and a great spoon of soda, a touch of salt, a drop of gin, and a dash of strychnine mixed with iodine. Guaranteed to do the trick." So Jane drinks it, and as she does, the witch says, "There you go, dearie. Soon your little problem will take care of itself good and proper." Then we cut to Jane back at home, and she is throwing up, like really violent vomiting. And Emma is trying to help her, saying, "That's my girl. You're doing just fine. There's nothing to be afraid of." And Jane's narration says, "Mother once told me that woman was created to suffer God's punishing the human race for original sin. I never believed her until now." So it seems that whatever that witch gave her does work, because we cut to Jane and Emma at the textile mill. And I didn't mention this before just because I assumed you guys might know what a textile mill looks like, but these are giant machines that these women are throwing cotton into. And all the machines have exposed belts and exposed motors and shivs and stuff that's spinning very, very fast that your arms and legs and other appendages can get stuck in very easily. So Emma is talking to Jane, and all of a sudden, Emma's arm gets stuck in one of the machines and actually gets pulled off. And Emma is on the floor, and she's yelling, of course, and she's bleeding out. And Jane runs over to her and starts yelling for a doctor and that she's bleeding to death. But as Jane looks around, no one does anything. Everybody just stands there. All the workers are too, I guess, beaten down or apathetic to care. And then we see Mr. Proctor walk up and he says, "Back to your stations. There's nothing to be done for her. So get back to work. That goes for you too, Miss Houston." And then we cut to later that day after work, and Jane is walking home and her narration says, "Dead. Emma's dead. They wrapped her in a tarp and carried her away like a sow in a slaughterhouse. What do I do now? I have no one to turn to. What do I tell the children? She's dead. My friend is dead. What else could go wrong?" And just as she thinks that, she overhears someone say, "Hurry, Jake, or we'll miss the fire." And as she watches the people run off in the direction of the fire to watch it, she realizes that that is where her house is. And it is in fact her house that is on fire. So as she sees the building burning, she runs inside yelling, "My babies, no!" And she is immediately caught on fire, and she runs completely through the house from like the front door through the back door. And out of the back door, she had mentioned this before, but there is a river there. So she's running on fire, screaming, and she plunges into the river, and the narration says, "Let it end. Please, let the punishment end now." And then as she dies, all of a sudden, something starts happening. The plant life in the river begins to envelop her, and she's thinking to herself, What's happening to me? What? And you may have guessed, but yes, she is turning into a swamp thing or plant elemental. And as she finishes this transformation, the narration says, "Yes, I see. And then she walks out of the river back to the factory. And at the factory, we're seeing the daughter of Emma, Miriam, is still working there. She's putting cotton into the machines. She's looking over at the machine that took her mom's arm and killed her. And she begins to cry. And we see Mr. Proctor walking around, and he's yelling at the ladies saying, "Come now, ladies, let's look alive." And then he sees Miriam crying and not doing work. And he walks over and wipes a tear off her face. And he creepily says to her, "Remember, idle hands are the devil's helpmates." So it seems like he's grooming her or something. But just as he's saying that creepy line, all of a sudden, the cotton that is running through the machines turns green and begins to grow a noose out of it. And it grabs Mr. Proctor and drags him into the machine. And we're talking like head on into the machine. So there ain't no way he lived. And then all the cotton begins to sprout and grow. And the gas lamps that are around begin to catch fire to everything. So of course, everybody starts freaking out. And in this chaos, Miriam has fallen down. And then she sees a woman's figure in the smoke walking towards her. And she says, "Please, lady, please help me." And the woman bends down and hugs her and lifts her up and pulls her out of the smoke and begins to walk out of the building. And then Miriam looks up and says, "Thank you, lady. You saved me." But as Miriam gets a better look at her savior, she's kind of startled and quieted because she looks at Jane and recognizes that it's Jane. But now Jane's skin and also the dress that she's wearing is bark or some other kind of plant life that is brown. And then her hair is made up of long green vines. So she takes Miriam a little bit away from the fire, sets her down on the ground, and then we get a panel of Lady Jane standing over Sheffield and looking at all the smokestacks and all the pollution coming up from these textile mills and other mills in town. And the narration says, "I understand so much more now. The pattern that was Alicia Houston's life seems so trivial compared to what I have glimpsed within the green. I have no children. I am the mother of all. I have been chosen to help nurture the green through this poison time. How long I will serve and in what manner is not for me to know." And then there's like an echo of the word no. And all of a sudden, Abby returns to right where she was before the vision, standing next to Lady Jane and Swamp Thing with Tefé. And she's kind of embarrassed. She's actually like holding herself and she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't." And then Abby goes in for a big hug and begins to cry into Lady Jane's chest. And Lady Jane says, "It's all right, my child. I know." And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember to stay swampy.